A rusted chain snapped without a sound, and Holmes knew why. "Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorne. I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? You're the best part of this mystery circle. Let's begin." It was on one of those dismal November mornings, when the London sky hung like a smudged sheet above the city, and the rain drummed listlessly against the windows of 221B Baker Street, that the singular affair of the rusted chain first came to our attention. I, Dr. John H. Watson, had resigned myself to a quiet morning with the British Medical Journal, content to ignore both the dreariness outdoors and the restlessness of my friend. Holmes, for his part, was reclining upon the sofa in his dressing gown, fingers steepled and eyes closed, not in repose, I should add, but in that peculiar meditative trance which I had long ago learned to respect. He had not spoken for over an hour, save for an occasional muttered remark about the tobacco content of a certain Egyptian blend, when there came a sudden rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson, ever prompt, admitted a visitor whose sharp footfalls preceded him into our sitting-room. The gentleman who entered was of a curious disposition. He wore a heavy black greatcoat, sodden with rain, and a dark velvet collar that marked him as a man of some means. Yet there was an unmistakable tremor in his hands, and the look in his eyes, wide, haunted, half-desperate, suggested a man under the weight of some invisible vice or fear. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice taut as a violin string. Holmes opened his eyes, sat up, and with the briefest of nods gestured to the armchair opposite. "You are expected, sir, though not by name," he said, coolly. "Please remove your gloves. They are lined with red merino wool, are they not? And I would advise against any further visits to that tobacconist on Bow Street. The Turkish blend he sells is cut with sawdust." The man gave a start. "How could you—" "My dear sir," Holmes interrupted with a thin smile, "the damp imprint of your gloves on the floor clearly shows the crimson interior, and the scent of the counterfeit tobacco arrived a moment before you did. But let us not delay with parlour tricks. Your name and your reason for calling." "I am Sir Benedict Ferrars," the man said at last, removing his gloves, "and I come on behalf of my sister, Lady Margaret Trilling. Her husband, Lord Alton Trilling, was found dead yesterday morning in the boathouse of our estate in Surrey. Scotland Yard believes it was an accident." "And you do not?" Sir Benedict paused, then leaned forward. "He was found hanging by a rusted chain, an old maritime length from the docks, not something kept at the house. The coroner believes it snapped under his weight, but there was something else. His boots were spotless. Not a speck of mud, though the path to the boathouse is a quagmire after the rains. And there were no footprints. None. Not even his own." Holmes' eyes glittered like cold steel. "No footprints? In a muddy field?" "None," as though he had descended from the clouds. I had picked up my pen by now, instinctively. Holmes rose to his feet, already transformed from the indolent philosopher to the keen predator. "And the chain?" he asked. "An old length, rusted near through, not fit to hold a rowboat, much less a man. The constable dismissed it as a tragic freak accident. But I found something else nearby." Sir Benedict reached into his coat and produced a small object, carefully wrapped in a square of linen. Holmes took it without a word, unwrapped it, and held up a delicate silver charm, a miniature padlock, no larger than a thimble. It was clean, untarnished, shining in stark contrast to the rusted chain. "A puzzle begins to form," Holmes murmured. "Tell me, Sir Benedict, who stands to benefit from Lord Trilling's death?" Sir Benedict's hands gripped the chair arms until his knuckles whitened. "His heir, My nephew Julian Trilling, a rather unsteady young man with a history of gambling debts, but he was in town the night before, at his club. He has witnesses." Holmes said nothing. He turned the padlock over in his fingers once, twice, and then looked out at the rain sliding down the window panes like melted glass. "I believe, Watson," he said at last, "we shall take the noon train to Surrey. The case, as you say, begins with a rusted chain, but I suspect it will end with something far more deliberate." He turned to Sir Benedict. "Until then, no one must disturb the boathouse, not even the yard. Do I make myself clear?" Sir Benedict nodded, though unease still clung to his features. And so, with fog rolling in off the Thames and a mystery already tugging at the seams of logic, we packed our bags. Neither of us spoke much on the train, but Holmes, as was his habit in moments such as these, hummed softly under his breath, a low, unsettling tune I had never heard before. Little did I know then how prophetic that tune would become. The train to Surrey cut its way through a cold drizzle, the landscape outside the window a blur of sodden fields and leafless trees. Holmes sat across from me, silent as ever, save for the steady tapping of his fingers against the armrest. From time to time he would glance down at the tiny padlock in his hand, examining its surface as if he expected it to speak. I made a few notes in my journal, but my thoughts kept returning to Sir Benedict's words. No footprints, a rusted chain, a spotless pair of boots. "It does not add up, Holmes," I said at last, breaking the stillness. "How can a man hang himself without leaving so much as a trace on the ground around him? If the path is muddy, and he walked there alone—" "Then there would be prints," Holmes finished for me. "Precisely, and yet there were none. Which tells us only one thing, Watson. That he did not walk there, or if he did, his tracks were erased deliberately. We must consider both possibilities." He fell silent again, and I knew better than to press him. Instead, I studied the silver padlock once more. It was curious, neatly crafted, clearly modern, and entirely out of place amid the grim details we had heard. It bore no initials or maker's mark, and the latch had never been forced. As the train pulled into the small station near the Trilling estate, the clouds had thickened, casting the countryside into a premature dusk. Sir Benedict was waiting on the platform in a dark umbrella cloak, his thin figure made more gaunt by the weather. "This way," he said quietly. "The carriage is ready." The ride from the station to the estate took little more than 10 minutes. I was struck at once by the isolation of the grounds. The land rolled downward in a soft bowl toward a modest lake fringed with reeds and bare willows, and beyond it, at the far bank, stood the boathouse, its slanted roof canted with age, and its walls streaked with moss and lichen. The manor itself was older still, a Georgian brick facade with ivy strangling the stone pillars near the entrance. Inside, the house was silent save for the ticking of a long-case clock in the hall. Sir Benedict led us to the drawing-room, where a woman in mourning black sat by the fire. Her profile was statuesque, proud, though her face was pale. "My sister," Sir Benedict said, "Lady Margaret." She rose slowly, offering Holmes a steady hand. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "thank you for coming. I do not believe my husband's death was an accident. But if it was murder, then I beg of you, find the truth, and do so discreetly. The family has suffered enough scandal for a lifetime." Holmes bowed slightly. "I shall do my utmost, Lady Trilling. May I ask, had your husband been distressed of late?" She looked away, her eyes flickering to the hearth. "He had become troubled. He was receiving letters, anonymous ones. They arrived without return addresses, and he burned them all, save one." Holmes's posture changed subtly. "He kept one?" She nodded and moved to a small escritoire, unlocking the drawer with a key from her necklace. From within, She produced a crumpled sheet of paper and handed it to Holmes. The handwriting was elegant, but precise, like that of a clerk or trained draftsman. Your past drags behind you like a chain, Alton. No matter how far you row, it will surface. Soon. There was no signature, no date, only that single sentence. Holmes read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. Thank you. Now, if it would not trouble you, I should like to see the body. Sir Benedict led us out once more, and we crossed the lawn toward the lake. The path curved downward into a hollow where the ground grew soft beneath our feet. I noted the reeds swaying in the wind and the slick, wet boards of the narrow dock. The boathouse stood at the water's edge, silent and forsaken. Inside, the air was cold and still. A faint scent of mildew and oil hung in the rafters. A single lamp hung from a hook near the door, casting a dull glow over the scene. The beam where the chain had been affixed bore a deep, rust-coloured gouge. A length of the corroded chain still dangled from it, broken at the middle. Nearby, a heavy iron ring lay on the floorboards. Holmes moved wordlessly across the room, examining the surroundings with practised ease. He crouched near the broken chain, lifting one of the links. "Tell me," he said to Sir Benedict without turning, "has anyone moved the body?" "No," he replied. "Not beyond the coroner's removal. The yard took photographs, but the place has been undisturbed since." Holmes moved to the doorway and peered outside. "Watson, come here." I joined him. He pointed to the muddy ground just beyond the threshold. "What do you see?" I frowned. The mud was churned in places, but oddly, no clear boot marks, only a vague disturbance, as if something heavy had been dragged or pressed flat. "No defined tracks," I said. "Exactly," Holmes murmured. "The mud has been disrupted, but not by a man walking. More like—" He paused, his gaze sweeping across the ground. Then he looked up toward the rafters inside. "You see the beam?" he asked. "It's quite high, nearly 10 feet from the floor, no ladder, and yet the chain was affixed through a bolt at the top." I followed his line of thought. "Then he could not have hung it himself. Someone else must have prepared the scene in advance," Holmes finished, "and likely used a pulley or similar apparatus to secure the chain. But what is more telling, why use a rusted chain at all? Why not rope? To suggest suicide? Despair? Perhaps. But this chain has an irregular break." He held up the severed link. "See here, corroded, yes, but fractured with force, not cleanly snapped by weight alone. Someone wanted it to give way." Holmes rose, brushing the mud from his knees. "We must return to the house. I wish to speak with the nephew." "Julian Trilling, was it?" Sir Benedict nodded. "He returned from London early this morning. He's upstairs." Julian Trilling received us in the billiard room, a long-limbed young man in his mid-20s with pale blonde hair and restless eyes. He rose when we entered, but there was an undercurrent of defensiveness in his manner. "You're Mr. Holmes, I presume?" he said, avoiding direct eye contact. "I am." "And you were in London the night before your uncle's death?" "At my club?" "The Reform. Can anyone verify that?" "Yes, several people. I left around midnight and stayed at the club overnight." "Tell me," Holmes said, walking slowly about the room, "had you any knowledge of your uncle's anonymous letters?" Julian looked surprised, then wary. "He mentioned one. Seemed irritated, not frightened. Do you recognize this?" Holmes handed him the tiny silver padlock. Julian turned it in his hand. Should I? Possibly. It was found near your uncle's body, unlocked and suspiciously out of place. Might it have come from something belonging to you? A personal box? A locket? I don't recognize it," he said, handing it back. Holmes pocketed the padlock. Very well, that will be all, for now. As we stepped into the hall, I whispered, "You believe him?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. He may be telling the truth about his location, but there's something off in his manner, less about guilt, more about fear. He paused, then looked up toward the grand staircase. "Someone in this house is lying, Watson, and not merely to protect themselves, but to protect a secret older than the chain that broke." We turned toward the study, the silver padlock still cold in Holmes' pocket, and the mystery deeper than ever. Back in the study, Holmes seated himself in an old leather armchair, his fingertips pressed together, eyes half closed, as if retreating into the labyrinth of his thoughts. I remained standing by the hearth, absently tracing a finger along the mantelpiece, acutely aware of the tension curling through the house like smoke. "I find myself haunted by that padlock, Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice low and measured. "It does not belong neither to the scene of death nor to the man who died there. It was placed, not dropped, not discarded, but placed with intent." "You believe it to be symbolic?" I asked. "A message of some kind? Perhaps. Or a signature. But whose? That is the pressing question." He leaned forward. "We must know more about Lord Trilling. And not the man presented in his obituary, but the man behind closed doors, a man who received anonymous threats, who met his end under the strangest of contrivances, and who left behind a widow entirely too composed. You don't believe Lady Margaret?" "I believe she mourns," Holmes replied. "But she is also withholding. Did you note how she referred to her husband's scandal in the past tense, yet failed to mention what it was? A woman guarding her family's name, yes, but perhaps also something else." There came a soft knock at the door. Sir Benedict entered with a hesitant air, his brow furrowed. "I thought you might like to see Lord Trilling's personal study," he said. "The police examined it, but found nothing of note. Margaret has refused to enter it since." Holmes stood immediately. "Excellent. Lead the way." We were taken through a narrow corridor to a locked door at the far end of the west wing. Sir Benedict handed Holmes a brass key and left us there. Holmes unlocked the door and swung it open, revealing a modest but elegant chamber lit by the late afternoon's dying light. Dust floated thick in the air. The room bore the atmosphere of long disused thought. Books lined the walls, papers cluttered the desk, and a decanter of brandy stood half full beside an untouched glass. Holmes made a slow circuit of the room. He touched nothing at first, simply studying the arrangement with his piercing gaze. Then he approached the writing desk and began methodically examining its contents. "Interesting," he murmured. "See here, Watson, a page torn from this blotter. Recently, too. The fibres are still raised." I stepped closer and saw the thin outline of an indented impression. Holmes held the page up to the light. "Do you recall my mirror and graphite method?" I nodded, and he extracted a small pouch from his coat, producing a soft graphite stick. With precise strokes, he darkened the blotting paper until a ghostly image emerged. The handwriting matched the letter we'd seen earlier. It read, "There are things beneath this house you cannot bury," with a title, "Alton? I know what happened in the year of the Red Flood." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "The year of the Red Flood? Does the phrase strike any chord with you?" "None," I admitted, "but it sounds like code. Or a memory." He moved to the bookshelves and began scanning titles, fingers flying across the spines. "Lord Trilling had an eye for naval history. See this collection of maritime logs, all carefully indexed by ship name and year, but nothing out of place." He paused. "Wait." From a high shelf, he drew a slim volume in faded green cloth. The Shipping Registers of Thames Mercantile Vessels, 1868. He flipped through the pages, stopping at a marked fold. "Here we are," he murmured. "The Red Flood, a cargo ship operated under the De Vries Line, sailed from Antwerp, presumed sunk off the Kent coast, 1868. Could that be what the letter referred to? Not just the ship, Watson, the year. The phrase may have been Lord Trilling's own euphemism. He was part of the Admiralty once, was he not? Before he inherited the title?" I nodded. "Yes, retired in 1870, according to Sir Benedict." Holmes returned to the desk, this time examining the lower drawers. One resisted. He jiggled it, frowned, and produced his lockpick. A few seconds passed, then the drawer slid open. Inside lay a stack of correspondence, tied with twine, and beneath that a small wooden box. Holmes opened the box carefully, revealing an assortment of age tokens, a rusted naval insignia, a faded photograph of 5 uniformed men, and a gold ring etched with the letters RF on the inside. Holmes studied the photograph, then passed it to me. "Do any of these men resemble Lord Trilling?" I examined the photograph. One of the men, broader in the face, with the same stern jawline, bore a strong resemblance to the portrait I'd seen above the drawing-room fireplace. "This must be him, but the others—" "Likely shipmates," Holmes said, "perhaps from the Red Flood, which begs the question, what happened aboard that ship that someone would threaten him for it 4 decades later?" He took the ring and held it up. "A signet, likely belonged to one of the crew, given to Trilling or taken." A sound from the hallway interrupted us. A floorboard creaked. Holmes froze. Then he stepped quickly to the door and flung it open. No one. Only the flickering shadows of evening and the distant patter of rain. He closed the door softly. Someone was listening. "You're certain?" He nodded. "And they left in haste. We'll find a mark on the floor." Indeed, just beyond the threshold, I spotted a scuffed heel print in the dust. Small, narrow, likely a woman's. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Lady Margaret, perhaps, or a servant sent to eavesdrop. In either case, the existence of the photograph and the letters must remain between us for now. We returned to the main hall, where the lamps had been lit, and the atmosphere of the house had changed, subtly but palpably. A hush had fallen over it, the kind that settles before a storm breaks. Dinner was served in uncomfortable silence. Lady Margaret was present, her features composed but distant. Julian excused himself early, citing a headache. Sir Benedict, for his part, watched Holmes with a nervous curiosity. Only after we had retired to our guest rooms did Holmes speak again. "Watson, we must visit the village tomorrow. I need the coroner's report, and I should like to speak to the gardener." "The gardener?" Indeed, he alone would tend the path to the lake. If anyone noticed footprints that were erased or tools out of place, it would be he. And the rest of the family? We tread lightly. There is history here, buried deeply. Trilling's death was not the first tremor. It was the consequence of long-held secrets. Tomorrow, I suspect, we shall unearth one of them. And with that, Holmes turned to his writing case and began scribbling a letter under the dim light, his pen moving swiftly. I lay awake for a time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and sighs of the old manor house, wondering how a rusted chain and a forgotten ship could drag a man into death after 40 years of silence. But Holmes, I knew, had already begun to see the shape of the truth, even if the rest of us were still fumbling in the dark. The next morning broke grey and cold, the skies still brooding over the countryside with an air of grim watchfulness. Holmes was already awake when I descended, pacing before the drawing-room windows with a cup of black coffee in one hand and the silver padlock in the other. "There is a kind of poetic symmetry to this case, Watson," he murmured, not turning to greet me. A man dies suspended by a rusted chain, symbol of bondage, decay, time, and nearby lies a spotless, uncorroded padlock, pristine and unopened, as if to say something old has ended and something tightly guarded remains. I did not immediately reply. Holmes had moods such as this, moments where metaphor tangled with deduction, and I had learned to let him unspool the thread. He set the padlock down. Let us go. The village coroner will have completed his report by now, and I am keen to speak with this gardener. I have a suspicion that what he saw, or did not see, may guide us to the next link in the chain, quite literally. The village of Lower Malling lay 2 miles from the estate, nestled along the edge of a chalk ridge and clustered with Tudor cottages whose crooked chimneys smoked gently in the chill. We found the coroner, Mr. Basil Finch, in a narrow building behind the parish church. He greeted us stiffly, adjusting his spectacles as Holmes introduced us. "I've seen to many unfortunate deaths," Finch said, retrieving the file from his desk. "But I must say this one left me with more questions than answers. Lord Trilling's neck broke, clean and immediate, but the weight that caused the chain to snap was curious." "Curious how?" Holmes asked, eyes already scanning the first page of the report. "The break occurred mid-length, at a point of existing rust, yes, but even then it should have held a man's weight. The link appears to have been filed or weakened deliberately. I reported this to Inspector Mallory from the yard. He dismissed it as conjecture." Holmes did not smile, but his voice sharpened. "Your conjecture, Dr. Finch, may be the one shred of reason amid a field of assumptions. May I keep this?" "You may," Finch said, surprised. "I thought it might interest someone with a mind for patterns. Scotland Yard was not particularly curious." Holmes nodded curtly and pocketed the report. Now, to the gardener. We walked back toward the Trilling estate along a hedge-lined lane, mist curling through the branches overhead. At the edge of the grounds we came upon a low, stone cottage with a modest greenhouse attached. A thin plume of smoke curled from its chimney, and the scent of wet earth and compost wafted from the open door. Inside we found a wiry man with a stooped back and tanned, creased skin. His name, as we soon learned, was Josiah Clay, gardener at the estate for over 20 years. He wore a flat cap and thick gloves and looked at Holmes with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I don't see much I can tell you. I tend the lawns and roses, but I wasn't nowhere near the lake that day. It's been too sodden to work that path lately." Holmes inclined his head politely. "It is precisely that path which interests me. You've walked it many times?" "Oh, aye. Laid the gravel myself when I was a lad. There's a narrow slope behind the boathouse most folks don't know. Used to carry sacks that way from the root cellar near the southern hedge." Holmes perked up. "A root cellar? That's not marked on the main estate map." Clay chuckled, a sound like a spade scraping stone. "Most folks forgot it. Used to be where the old gamekeeper stored potatoes and such. It's got an iron hatch, near invisible now under the nettles." "Show me," Holmes said at once. We followed Clay around the far edge of the property, past a crumbling stone wall and down a narrow trail overgrown with brambles. After 5 minutes' walk, Clay stopped and pointed to a patch of wild growth. Holmes knelt and swept the weeds aside, revealing the corner of a rusted iron hatch set flush to the ground. "No one's touched that in years," Clay said. Holmes examined the hinges. "Yet someone has recently. Look here, Watson. The hinge on the left is freshly oiled. The rust has been disturbed, and this," he tapped a small iron loop, "was once locked." He reached into his coat and withdrew the silver padlock. It slid into the loop with a soft click. A perfect fit. We both stared at it. "This was it," I breathed. "This is where it came from." Holmes said nothing for a moment. then withdrew the padlock again and slipped it back into his pocket. He turned to Clay. "You've seen no one near here?" "No, sir, but truth be told, I don't walk this way much anymore. Miss Margaret, Lady Trilling, asked to have this part of the grounds left alone, said she didn't like the memories." Holmes's expression did not change, but I could sense the current of thought running deep behind his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Clay. You've been most helpful." We returned to the manor, where Holmes made straight for the drawing room and rang for Sir Benedict. "The root cellar," Holmes began without preamble, "was once used to store produce. But I believe Lord Trilling used it for something else. Do you know what that might be?" Sir Benedict paled slightly. I was never told. I thought it had been sealed." "It had, recently, and with a modern padlock. One that matches the item found at the scene of Lord Trilling's death. Your sister asked that part of the garden be left untouched. Might I ask why?" She said it reminded her of the early years of the marriage, before they moved to the larger wing. I never questioned it." Holmes's eyes never left his face. "I believe the cellar holds something linked to the Red Flood, a secret your brother-in-law carried with him for decades. I intend to discover what that is." As Sir Benedict left, clearly shaken, Holmes turned to me. "The padlock, the chain, the photograph, all threads pointing to a single knot. And now we know where that knot may be tied." "We return to the cellar then?" I asked. "Tonight," he said. "After darkness falls. I would prefer no one know of our visit, not yet." The hours crawled past. Holmes barely moved from his chair, while I occupied myself with my notes and a growing unease that I could not quite name. At 10 minutes past 11, we crept down the servants' stair, out through the back of the house, and into the cold night. The grounds were quiet. The sky had cleared to reveal a crescent moon, and under its pale light we made our way again to the root cellar. Holmes crouched by the hatch and pried it open with a pocket lever. A faint rush of musty air escaped, tinged with something metallic. We descended slowly, Holmes first, with his lantern raised. The cellar walls were stone and damp, the floor lined with broken crates and rotted burlap sacks. At the far end stood a second door, heavy and reinforced, with old iron bands. It bore no lock, only a latch. Holmes paused before it, then slowly pushed it open. Inside was a room not of produce or forgotten tools, but of records, nautical charts, sealed crates stamped with foreign ports, and a single oilskin-bound logbook resting atop a desk. Holmes opened it and read the first entry aloud. March 17, 1868, the hold secured. The cargo loaded under cover of night. Captain unaware of contents. If any soul learns what lies below deck, we are all lost. He turned the page, then looked up at me. "We have found the secret, Watson. The Red Flood did not sink. It vanished because it carried something no one wanted found, and I suspect Lord Trilling helped ensure it stayed buried." In the silent dark of that forgotten room, surrounded by the relics of a long-dead voyage, I felt the first real chill of the case, not from the air, but from the shadows we had disturbed. Shadows which, I now understood, someone was still desperate to keep intact. Holmes stood motionless in the faint lantern light, his eyes scanning the pages of the logbook with the detached intensity of a man reading not mere words, but secrets etched in flame. I peered over his shoulder, catching fragments of old entries, dates, terse statements, coded references to cargo beneath the manifest, and ominous remarks about sealed compartments and payments in untraceable coin. It was not smuggling of the common sort, that much was clear. "This logbook is not from the captain," Holmes murmured. "These are the entries of an officer, possibly Trilling himself. He would have been a junior naval attaché at the time. Someone trusted, but not fully in command. See this passage here. Lieutenant T mentions taking orders from B de V. That name again, de Vries. Dutch mercantile ties, likely the shipping line's shadow benefactor. I could not help but feel the weight of time pressing in on us, as though the air of the chamber remembered too well what had passed. The faint tang of rust and salt lingered even after so many years. Holmes closed the book. This room was a vault of memory, one Lord Trilling guarded for decades, not from curiosity but from reckoning. "You believe it connects to his death?" I asked quietly. "More than that. I believe it is the cause of it." He stepped to the far corner, examining the crates stacked neatly, untouched by recent hands. They were stamped with faded markings: schooner, red flood, Antwerp, and strange emblems that suggested military surplus. One bore the imprint of a stylized eagle, not British. Holmes tested the lid of one with his cane. The wood gave slightly. "We mustn't open these here," he said. "If they hold what I suspect, artifacts, contraband or worse, it will be for the authorities to catalogue, but the implications are plain. Trilling kept these hidden all his life?" Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "And someone discovered the secret, someone with reason enough to want it buried again, permanently. That rusted chain was not merely a prop, it was a message." We ascended from the cellar in silence, sealing the hatch behind us. The wind had picked up, and across the fields the manor loomed dark and solemn against the moonlight. Holmes was deep in thought as we re-entered the house through the side door and moved toward the stairs. As we passed the library, a sound halted us, a low creak, followed by a muffled clink of glass. Holmes froze and gestured for silence. He stepped into the shadow and peered through the slightly ajar door. I saw it too, the glint of lamplight on gold, and then the profile of Julian Trilling seated at the writing desk, pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. He did not hear us approach. "You keep late hours," Holmes said evenly, stepping into the room. Julian started violently, sloshing the brandy. "Mr. Holmes, what the devil—" "It is we who should ask you that, Mr. Trilling," Holmes said. "You were eavesdropping last night, on us. You followed us to the study." Julian opened his mouth to deny it, but his face betrayed him before his words could. Holmes did not wait. "You knew about the cellar. You knew what was hidden below. Did your uncle confide in you?" "No," Julian said at last. His voice was flat, but his eyes had taken on a strange, distant gleam. "But I knew he was hiding something to do with his past in the Navy. I was a child when he burned his journals, but I found scraps, references to Red Flood. I thought it was madness. Then I found a key among his effects last year. I tried the hatch once. It wouldn't open. I thought better of it." "But you told someone," Holmes said. Julian's jaw tightened. "I didn't mean to. I was drunk and angry." "Who did you tell?" He hesitated, then dropped his gaze. "Lady Trilling." "My aunt." There was a long silence. Holmes moved closer. "She claimed to have no knowledge of the letters he received." "She lied," Julian said softly. "She hated him in the end. I heard them argue, awful rows. I think she feared what would come out if he talked. About that voyage, about the crew. He'd drink, rant about justice unfinished and names on the ledger. It frightened her." Holmes stepped back, digesting this. And yet she played the grieving widow flawlessly. Julian drained his glass. She always could act. When we returned to our rooms, the house was still, but sleep did not come to me. Holmes sat by the window, smoking in silence, the logbook open on his lap. The next morning he insisted we speak again with Lady Trilling. She received us in her private sitting room. Her mourning veil was gone, and her face bore the cool composure of a woman long practiced in restraint. "My lady," Holmes began without flourish, "the truth now serves you better than silence. You know what lies beneath your grounds, the secret your husband guarded." She stiffened, but said nothing. "Your nephew told us he spoke to you of it, and that your husband received threatening letters. You led us to believe otherwise." Her expression did not waver. "What I said was true. I never read the letters. I burned them at his request. He feared what others would make of his past." "Then he was guilty?" Her eyes darkened. "He was ashamed. There's a difference. He was a young man, eager to advance, eager to obey. He followed orders on that ship, orders that led to death. When he learned what had really happened, what had been hidden in those crates, he tried to expose it. They shut him down, threatened his commission. The Admiralty buried it, and he buried it with them." Holmes said nothing. He let her words echo in the silence. "He kept that cellar like a tomb," she continued, quieter now. "But it was always there, between us, and in the end I believe it killed him." "You think it was suicide?" I asked. She looked at me, and for the first time, something genuine flickered in her eyes, regret, perhaps, or resignation. "I think he believed it was coming for him, that someone had found out. I think he chose how it would end." Holmes stepped forward. "But someone helped it end. The filed chain, the lack of footprints, the staging. That is no suicide, my lady. It was meant to look accidental. It was meant to collapse under the weight of years." Lady Trilling said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly. Holmes nodded once. "That will be all for now." In the hallway, I turned to him. "You believe she had a hand in it?" "No," he said, "but she knows who did, and she's shielding them out of loyalty or fear, possibly both." We were about to descend when a servant approached with a note. "Delivered just now, sir." By hand, Holmes opened it, his brow furrowing. "Meet me at the lake at dusk. Come alone. A friend of justice." He looked up at me. It seems someone else would like to speak, and whoever it is, they've been watching. A pause. "Prepare yourself, Watson. We are about to meet the person who holds the final piece, and I suspect they've been waiting for us longer than we realize." The air that evening had taken on a biting edge, the wind slipping through the trees like a whisper of warning. Holmes and I descended the sloping lawn as the last light fled from the sky, the outline of the lake growing darker with each step. The boathouse loomed ahead, silent and still. A veil of mist clung low over the water's surface, blurring the reflections of the reeds and the half-submerged dock. Holmes walked with measured steps, his silhouette rigid with focus. Though the note had asked him to come alone, he had made no objection to my silent accompaniment. We both understood there was safety in numbers, and besides, the writer had not specified two would be unwelcome. A faint rustling reached us just before the figure emerged from the shadows by the boathouse. It was Josiah Clay, the gardener. His shoulders were hunched, and his eyes flitted anxiously across the darkened grounds. "You received my note?" he asked Holmes, his voice low and rough. "I did," Holmes replied. "You took a risk." Clay nodded slowly. "Didn't know who else to turn to. I've worked this land near 30 years, Mr. Holmes. I've seen things, heard whispers, but this went too far." "Then speak plainly," Holmes said. "Time grows short, and I believe you have more to reveal than you've allowed." Clay hesitated, then reached into his coat and drew out a folded envelope, thick, yellowed, bound with twine. He held it out. "He gave me this," the gardener said. "Lord Trilling, just 2 weeks before he died. Told me if anything happened to him, if it looked wrong, I was to get it into the right hands. but I didn't know who that was until you arrived." Holmes took the envelope and opened it with great care. Inside was a letter and several photographs, grainy, sun-bleached, but damning in their implications. One showed a line of men unloading crates from a ship, the Red Flood, unmistakably marked on the hull. Another displayed a wooden box, partially open, revealing not weapons or contraband, but something even more disturbing, an interior lined with cloth and what appeared to be shackled iron rings. Holmes scanned the letter quickly, then folded it again. He turned to Clay. "Did you read it?" "I did, enough to understand what he was part of." Watson moved beside him. "Human trafficking," he said grimly. Clay nodded. "He said they thought it was arms. That's what the orders claimed. But one night, on the open sea, he broke open one of the crates. What he found, he never spoke of it fully, only that he could never forget. He went to the Navy Board. They silenced him. His promotion was buried, and he spent the rest of his life trying to atone." Holmes stared out at the dark lake, and someone else knew. "Aye, that's the worst of it. Someone aboard with him, another officer, someone who benefited from the silence, and who knew Trilling might one day break it. He didn't name them in the letter, but he wrote about being watched, about messages left in his study. Someone wanted the past to stay buried." Holmes remained silent for several seconds, then turned to the gardener again. "And the night he died, did you see anything?" "I heard a noise," Clay admitted. "I was in the potting shed. It must have been near midnight. A lantern moving toward the lake. At first, I thought it was Lord Trilling himself. He often walked when he couldn't sleep. But then I saw another light, fainter. From the side of the boathouse, I stayed hidden. Then I saw a figure coming back alone, quick and low, taking the side path. I couldn't make out the face." Holmes inhaled sharply. "Male or female?" "Could have been either. They moved like they'd done it before." Holmes pressed the envelope into his coat and looked past Clay toward the boathouse. "Stay vigilant, Mr. Clay. You may have placed yourself in considerable danger, but you've done the right thing." As we made our way back up to the house, Holmes's mood was unreadable. He stopped halfway along the path and turned to me. "Watson, what we now possess is proof of a crime buried under layers of shame and silence. Trilling may not have spoken the full truth to anyone, not even to his wife, but someone else did more than fear the truth. They acted. You believe the killer was a fellow officer?" Holmes nodded. "One who knew exactly what the cellar held, one who had something to lose if Trilling unsealed the past." "But how could they have known Trilling was preparing to speak out after all these years?" Holmes tapped the breast of his coat. "Because he told someone he trusted, or once did, and that person passed the warning on either deliberately or under coercion." We returned to the manor where the drawing-room fire had dwindled to embers. Lady Margaret was not in sight, nor was Sir Benedict, but Julian stood at the window, smoking. He turned as we entered. "You've been out," he said, stating the obvious. Holmes closed the door behind us. "Mr. Trilling, I must ask you one final question, and I urge you to answer truthfully. When you told your aunt about the cellar and the documents, were you alone?" Julian frowned. "Yes. Why?" "Did you ever speak of it to anyone else, a friend, a visitor?" He looked puzzled, then hesitant. "Only one. There was a man, retired Navy, came to visit last year, briefly. Said he served with my uncle, stayed for lunch, then left. But I may have mentioned it then in passing. I didn't think much of it." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "This man, did he give a name?" "Commander Balfour, I believe. Gregory... Balfour." The name froze Holmes in place. "I know that name," he said. "Mentioned in the naval logs Trilling preserved, not as captain, as quartermaster. He would have had access to all manifests, and if he climbed the ranks in peacetime, he'd now have significant connections. He knew what they carried. Julian looked stricken. "Do you think he's the one—" Holmes cut him off. "He's the one who visited, the one who saw the cellar, who realized the proof had survived, and who knew at that moment that Lord Trilling could no longer be allowed to speak." There was a knock at the door. A footman entered, looking rattled. "Begging your pardon, sir, but a man's just arrived at the gate. Said he's here to call upon Sir Benedict. Wouldn't give his name." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, then turned to Julian. "Stay here. Do not let your aunt out of sight. Watson, come." We followed the servant through the hallway and out onto the front steps. A carriage stood at the base of the drive, the lamps unlit. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stood beside it, coat drawn tight against the cold. Holmes descended the stairs, his tone deceptively casual. "Good evening. You're calling rather late." The man turned slowly. His features were weathered, deep lines cut into a face shaped by command and salt air. But the eyes were cold, watchful. "I'm here to settle a matter," he said simply. "A private matter." Holmes took a step forward. "Commander Balfour, I presume?" There was a pause, the slightest tick in the corner of the man's eye. "You've made a mistake." "No," Holmes said. "You have. And it was in believing the past could be sealed by silence, and the present by murder." The man didn't move, but I saw the glint of metal at his side. Holmes saw it too. "You'll find we're not unarmed," Holmes said coolly. "And Scotland Yard is already on its way. I took the liberty of telegraphing them before we left for the lake." There was no fight. Only a long, bitter exhale from Balfour, then a slow, resigned step backward. He raised his hand slightly, as though the weight of his own guilt had finally pinned them in place. Holmes spoke softly, almost as if to himself. 40 years of secrets, Commander, and all it took was one rusted chain to bring them down." Commander Balfour was taken into the manor under close watch, his coat removed, and any weapon discreetly confiscated by Holmes and the footman under the guise of hospitality. The drawing-room, once a place of solemn decorum and family grieving, now held the taut silence of accusation. Balfour sat in the high-backed chair nearest the fireplace, his broad shoulders casting a warped shadow along the carpet. Holmes stood before him, arms folded, his face inscrutable, but alert. I remained near the hearth, watching Lady Margaret and Sir Benedict, both recently summoned, enter and settle on the far settee with visible tension. Julian arrived moments later, hovering by the doorway, his knuckles white around the handle. Holmes began without preamble. "Commander Gregory Balfour, born 1835, former quartermaster of the Red Flood, attached to the De Vries Shipping Consortium under naval charter, retired with honours in 1894, never court-martialed, never censured, decorated in his final years of service. Curious, given the nature of your past?" Balfour met his gaze evenly, but said nothing. "You came here once before," Holmes continued. "Last year you dined in this very house, under the pretext of camaraderie. You spoke with Julian Trilling. He mentioned a locked cellar, a family secret. You took the bait." Still Balfour said nothing. Holmes did not seem perturbed. "You returned again, uninvited, after Lord Trilling received the first of several threatening letters, ones penned, I strongly suspect, by you. You feared he would speak, that he would reveal the truth, that the secret you had helped bury would surface at last." Balfour's lips curled slightly. "I see you fancy yourself a historian, Mr. Holmes." "I am merely attentive to pattern and motive," Holmes replied. "And in you I see both in abundance." Lady Margaret, until then rigid in her silence, leaned forward. "What truth?" she asked sharply. "What did Alton do?" Holmes looked to her. "Not what he did, what they did. The crew of the Red Flood did not carry arms or tobacco, as the manifests claimed. The crates they hauled contained men and women, bound, drugged, and traded. Lord Trilling was told it was munitions. He discovered the truth only midway through the voyage. When he tried to expose it, he was silenced by higher command, but he kept a record, and he kept evidence." Lady Margaret recoiled. "And you knew this?" she asked Balfour. He finally spoke, voice hoarse but steady. "I knew what was at stake. You think justice is some neat ledger, but it's written in survival, in loyalty. We were young, Margaret. We followed orders. But Trilling, he could not let it lie. Even after 40 years, he was ready to undo everything." "You murdered him," Julian said, the words like stones dropped in still water. Balfour's expression flickered. "He forced my hand. You don't understand. If he had gone public, it would not have ended with him. Names, families, everything we protected would have been destroyed." "So you came in the night," Holmes said quietly. "You waited near the boathouse. You watched him approach. You followed at a distance, then crept behind the structure using the hidden slope Josiah Clay showed us. You reached the beam in advance, fixed the rusted chain, pre-cut at the critical link. A timed failure, just enough corrosion to make it believable. When he climbed onto the crate to adjust the lamp, an old man who often fussed with the boathouse, you looped the chain around his neck and shoved the crate away. The chain held until it didn't, and when it snapped, it left no trace of your hand." Lady Margaret rose, ashen. "You killed my husband because he tried to tell the truth?" "I preserved what little honor remained," Balfour growled. His guilt was a threat to us all. He was going to publish, he told Clay. He sent letters to the Admiralty. It would have been a scandal the Empire couldn't withstand. I tried to reason with him. He refused, so I acted. "You acted," Holmes repeated, voice brittle with contempt. "You used your position, your experience, your knowledge of naval equipment to construct the illusion of suicide. You erased your own steps, avoided the mud, exited through the side path, and left no trace but a glint of a padlock near the reeds." "Padlock?" Balfour's brow furrowed, momentarily thrown. Holmes reached into his coat and produced the gleaming silver lock. "You didn't place it," he said slowly. "Interesting. That confirms it. The padlock wasn't yours, it wasn't part of the scene you staged, which means someone else was there, watching." Julian stepped forward, shocked. "You think someone else followed him?" Holmes nodded, eyes flicking toward the hallway. "There's one person in this house who's remained quiet. Too quiet. A silent observer, a listener. Someone who moved through the corridors unnoticed." As if summoned by cue, the library door creaked open. A young woman stood there, slender, pale, and plainly dressed in servant's attire. Her name was Clara Bell, a housemaid I had scarcely noticed since our arrival. She stood with her hands clasped and her chin high, but there was something tight and fragile in her manner. Holmes turned to her gently. "Clara, you placed the padlock, didn't you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I found it near the hatch 2 days before Lord Trilling died. I thought someone had broken in. I tried to tell him. He dismissed it, said it was nothing." "But you knew it wasn't," Holmes said. "And when you saw Balfour near the lake that night—" "I followed him," she whispered. "I was curious, then frightened. I hid behind the boathouse. I saw him push the crate. I saw Lord Trilling fall, and I ran." Julian crossed to her. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I was afraid," Clara said, eyes wet. "I thought
I thought if I left the padlock there, someone like you might notice it, might realize something wasn't right." "You were brave," Holmes said softly. "You risked more than you know." Balfour scoffed. "So a servant girl and a rusted chain bring me down. Fitting." "No," Holmes said. "What brings you down is your own past. You merely gave it the opportunity to rise." The clock on the mantel struck 9. Outside, the distant sound of a motor car echoed through the hour.
Dark. Scotland Yard had arrived, punctual as ever. Inspector Mallory entered moments later, flanked by 2 constables. Holmes handed him the sealed envelope, the logbook, and the photographs. "This is everything," Holmes said. "A confession lies in these pages, though its author is no longer alive to elaborate. Commander Balfour, however, may prove less reticent." Balfour offered no protest as he was escorted from the room. Only a long, quiet glance back at the fire, and a whisper I barely caught. Better men than me stayed silent. And with that, he was gone. Holmes stood still for a moment, as though listening to something far away. Then he turned, his tone lighter. "Watson, I believe our case has reached its conclusion." I exhaled slowly, the tension lifting from my chest. "A grim one, Holmes?" "Yes," he said, "but just in its own way." Lady Margaret, pale but composed, stepped toward Holmes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for uncovering the truth, even if it breaks the heart to hear it." He bowed slightly. "Truth, my lady, rarely asks permission." We left the manor just past midnight. Fog hung low over the fields again, as if the earth itself were exhaling the secrets it had long kept buried. As the carriage bore us back toward London, I looked back once to see the faint glow of the manor's windows, dim now, but warm. Holmes sat beside me, silent. He pulled the silver padlock from his pocket once more, examined it under the lantern's glow, then placed it gently in his coat. "I may keep this," he said. "A memento?" I asked. He shook his head. "A reminder." And with that, the mist swallowed the house behind us, and we left Surrey for the smoke and swirl of the city, the puzzle of the rusted chain finally unravelled. We returned to Baker Street the following morning beneath a leaden sky, the clouds pressing low as if the heavens themselves bore witness to what had passed in Surrey. Holmes remained uncharacteristically quiet on the journey, his fingers steepled in that familiar pose but his eyes absent, fixed not on the passing scenery, but upon some inner landscape that remained hidden even from me. I knew better than to press him during such moods. His mind was still sorting through the aftermath, not only of the crime itself, but of the history it had unearthed. When we finally stepped inside our lodgings, Mrs. Hudson greeted us with warm tea and a furrowed brow, though Holmes barely acknowledged her kindness beyond a murmur of thanks. He set his coat aside with an absent flick and moved to the fireplace, where the ashes from the previous night's fire still held a ghost of warmth. The silver padlock had not left his pocket since the night before, and he now placed it atop the mantel, where it caught the light with an ironic gleam. "You were troubled," I said, easing into my usual chair. "Not troubled, Watson," Holmes replied, quietly, pensive. He turned and regarded the padlock a moment longer before crossing to the desk and pulling a sheaf of paper from the drawer. It was the official report sent by Inspector Mallory that morning, a concise summary of Balfour's arrest, his initial refusal to speak, and then, at last, his confession. A single line, inked in a scrawled, bitter hand, stood out in stark contrast. He was going to expose us all. I stopped him. I'd do it again. Holmes tossed the report aside. "There is something uniquely poisonous about delayed guilt, Watson. Balfour had lived 4 decades cloaked in silence, and when the spectre of consequence finally loomed, he mistook it for betrayal. The man was not merely protecting his past, he was preserving the illusion that it had been justified. "And Trilling?" I asked. Holmes's expression softened. A man who bore his remorse quietly but not idly, he tried, in his own way, to reclaim his honour. That cellar, it was a vault of truth, and ultimately it cost him his life. I nodded, reflecting on the image of those damp stone walls, the logbook resting like a gravestone above the past. "And the girl," I said, "Clara Bell. Had she not left that padlock behind?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Then Balfour's scheme might have succeeded entirely. It is a curious thing, is it not? The smallest anomaly, a misplaced object, a glint in the mud, may unspool the grandest deception. Clara saw something she could not interpret, and instead of dismissing it, she marked it. A minor act, but it set the gears in motion. She may have saved the family." "She may have saved many," Holmes corrected, rising to pour himself a cup of tea. "Scotland Yard is now combing through the records left in the cellar. With the Red Flood's manifest and those photographs, they'll be able to trace the wider network, what's left of it." He drank, then returned to his chair and lit a cigarette. The air in the room grew thick with thought and smoke. "There is one element, Watson, that continues to trouble me," he said. "Not in the sense of unsolved mystery, but in the weight it carries." I looked up. "And what is that?" "The question of legacy. We spend so much of our lives constructing it. Balfour chose his, an image of valour and loyalty. Trilling's was one of regret and redemption. Both knew the same truths, but only one let those truths guide his final acts." "Balfour lived without conscience," I said. Holmes shook his head. Number he had conscience. That was the problem. It festered, unacknowledged. By the time it erupted, it was too late for principle. Only fear remained. A man's conscience, if neglected too long, becomes not a moral compass, but a minefield. We fell into silence. Outside, the rain began to fall again, soft, persistent, threading through the eaves and onto the street below. London was returning to its rhythm, as it always did, indifferent to the dramas unfolding behind its brick facades. "Holmes," I said after a time, "do you believe Trilling meant to confess publicly? To bring it all into light?" "I do," Holmes answered without hesitation. "It is no coincidence that he contacted an old friend at the War Office 3 days before his death, and there was a letter, unsent, found among his papers, addressed to a naval tribunal. He feared Balfour might act first, but he did not let that fear stop him. He died for that choice, but he died with clarity." I stood and moved to the window, watching the blur of umbrellas below. "You've solved many cases, Holmes, but this one, it feels different." He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "How so?" I hesitated. It reached deeper. It revealed not just a single crime, but the long shadow of one. Not a murder alone, but the chain of silence that made it possible. Holmes nodded slowly. "Precisely. That is why I shall not forget it. Not because of the deductions or the mechanics, though they were satisfying in their own way, but because it revealed how easily silence can rot into complicity." He stood then, crossing to the mantelpiece once more. He picked up the padlock, turned it over in his fingers, and then, without warning, tossed it into the hearth. It landed with a soft clink among the ashes. "No mementos, Watson," he said. "Let the fire have it." I watched the lock sit motionless in the grey dust, its surface dulled by soot. "And what now?" I asked. "Another case?" Holmes smiled faintly, the old spark returning to his eyes. "They always come, Watson. The city never sleeps, and neither do its secrets." He paused, then added, "But perhaps not today. Today, I think, is for silence, not the kind that conceals, but the kind that honours. I understood. We did not speak again for some time. The fire burned lower, the room growing dim as evening approached. Outside, London continued to pulse and breathe, unaware that somewhere in its southern county, justice had finally stirred after 4 decades of sleep. And within the quiet walls of 221B, Sherlock Holmes allowed himself for once a moment of stillness. It was 3 days later when the next ripple reached us, small, nearly imperceptible, and yet unmistakably connected to the dark waters we had stirred in Surrey. I had just returned from a morning appointment with a patient when I found Holmes at the breakfast table, untouched toast before him, and a letter spread open in his hand. His gaze met mine with a glint I had come to associate not with mere interest, but with a sharpening of focus. The case, it seemed, was not quite done. "Watson," he said, folding the letter with precision, "I believe we've awakened more than just a solitary criminal. This," he tapped the envelope, "is the echo." I removed my coat, immediately alert. Another letter from Scotland Yard. Number. This is from Sir Hugh, Calder of the Colonial Office. A name you may recall from the Red Flood's manifest. He was the dispatch liaison listed on 2 of the flagged cargo entries. At the time, we believed him long dead, but it appears he is very much alive and increasingly agitated. I took the letter, scanning it quickly. Sir Hugh had written with a tone of veiled panic, requesting a meeting at his private club that very afternoon. He made no mention of Balfour or the Trilling affair by name, but he referenced certain records and unsettling inquiries now reaching his doorstep, and finally a cryptic phrase. The chain was meant to hold us all. Holmes stood. There are loose ends still weaving themselves into the fabric, Watson. If Balfour acted to silence Trilling, then Calder, who occupied a much higher perch in that infernal ladder, may now fear being pulled down with him. Shall we pay him a visit? We arrived at the Belgrave Club just before noon. It was a quiet, exclusive place tucked behind a row of grand stucco buildings in Knightsbridge, its entrance marked only by a brass plaque and the faint scent of cigars and cologne. Sir Hugh met us in one of the private reading rooms, a tall, pallid man with thinning hair and eyes that rarely settled in one place for long. He greeted Holmes with the forced civility of a man who recognized a threat in polite clothing. "I hoped you'd come quickly," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he gestured us into chairs. "I know who you are, Mr. Holmes, and I know what you've uncovered." Holmes offered only a nod. "Then you'll understand my urgency. Commander Balfour has confessed. The cellar on the Trilling estate has been opened. The documents have been read." Sir Hugh flinched. "You have no idea what those papers mean. The Red Flood was only one piece, a shadow vessel in a shadow fleet." "Then perhaps you'd care to enlighten us," Holmes said calmly. Sir Hugh leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You must understand the Empire in those years was held together by desperate measures. We were at war in all but name. The markets, the ports, the channels of power, they were unstable. Men like Balfour were tasked with maintaining balance. Trilling was not supposed to find out. And when he did, he was expected to fold back into the system. He didn't, I said. Number he fractured. He made records. And when I learned last year that he'd begun gathering them again, summoning old names, writing to the War Office, I knew it would end badly. "You told Balfour," Holmes said. Sir Hugh didn't answer. But his silence was damning. Holmes stood and paced slowly to the tall windows. "You feared exposure, so you whispered to a man with blood on his hands, trusting he'd be desperate enough to act." I didn't order him to do anything, Sir Hugh said quickly. Number. But you opened the gate and left the hound.
Unchained. Sir Hugh seemed to wilt, his shoulders collapsing inward. What happens now? Will they come for me? Perhaps, Holmes said coolly. Perhaps not. That depends on what else you disclose, and how quickly. Sir Hugh looked between us, the weight of decades settling across his face. There are other logs, other ships. I don't know where all of them are, but I can give you names, locations. Write them down, Holmes said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. When we returned to Baker Street later that afternoon, Holmes placed Sir Hugh's list upon the desk and regarded it as one mitre bomb with a hidden fuse. There were 9 ships named, each with a corresponding port and year, stretching across Africa, the West Indies, and the Far East. All tied to clandestine supply chains, all with notations beside them in an older, darker hand, secured, sealed, scrubbed. Holmes traced the final name with a finger. Erebus, 1870, Mozambique Channel. This is what Trilling feared, he said, that even if he spoke, the web was too large, that pulling one thread would only tighten the rest. But it's unravelling now, I said. You've begun it. Holmes looked up at me, something distant in his expression. Watson, the truth is not a lever to move the world. It is a key to a room few wish to enter. We have opened that door. Whether the light it reveals will cleanse or consume remains to be seen. The days that followed were filled with letters, some from the Yard, some from unnamed parties using intermediaries and aliases. There were inquiries cloaked as denials, requests for meetings that Holmes refused, and even an attempt, quiet, ineffectual, to bribe Clara Bell into silence. She, to her credit, brought the envelope directly to Scotland Yard. The case had become a shadow within Whitehall. Not official, not public, but very real. An internal review was launched. Files once sealed were being quietly examined under the guise of maritime regulation. There would be no scandal in the press, not yet, but the edifice had been struck, and the tremor was spreading. One evening, as Holmes and I sat again by the fire, he returned to the only item left from the Trilling affair that he had kept, the photograph of the Red Flood's crew. 5 men standing in a row on the ship's deck, their faces half lit by the sun. Holmes tapped each one in turn. Trilling, Balfour, Rourke, Madani, and one unnamed, perhaps Calder's list will identify him. You intend to pursue them? I asked. If they are still alive. Yes. He placed the photograph down, then leaned back, gazing into the fire. Watson, he said after a time, we've spent much of our work exposing crimes of passion, of impulse, of inheritance and jealousy and fear, but there are crimes that ferment, that lie in ledgers and logs. They wear uniforms, they fly flags, and when they rise, they do so not with blood, but with silence. And how does one defeat silence? Holmes turned to me then, and for the first time in days, there was something unmistakably fierce in his eyes. By refusing to honour it. He said nothing more. The fire hissed softly. Outside, the lamps of London glowed like dim stars, indifferent as ever, but now perhaps less untouched by the truths being drawn into light. It was 2 weeks to the day since we had left Surrey, and already the storm that had begun with a rusted chain now pressed up against the polished gates of London's most sacred institutions. Holmes had not slept more than a few hours at a time, and the rhythm of 221B Baker Street had shifted accordingly. Tea gone cold on the desk, telegrams arriving at odd hours, notes and maps covering the sitting-room table like a cartographer's nightmare. I had begun to fear the weight of the case would consume him entirely, but that morning brought something different. Not a letter, not a summons, not another name scrawled in a forgotten log, but a visitor. Mrs. Hudson showed him up with a doubtful glance. He was not the sort Holmes typically entertained, a man perhaps in his early 40s, clean-shaven, conservatively dressed, with the rigid bearing of a clerk or mid-level administrator. Yet when he removed his gloves and offered his hand, Holmes took it at once. "Mr. Aldwych," Holmes said, motioning to the chair across from him. "From the War Office, unless I'm mistaken." The man nodded. "Second Office, Internal Affairs to be precise. You were expecting me?" "I was expecting someone," Holmes replied. "That it's you suggests the matter has climbed beyond whispers." Aldwych settled himself with restraint. "Let me speak plainly. The matter of the Red Flood and her affiliates is now classified under Section 7 of the Internal Maritime Security Act. What you uncovered in Surrey is no longer a matter of private crime. It falls under strategic review." Holmes smiled thinly. Strategic review, a phrase that often precedes selective amnesia. Aldwych did not smile. "Mr. Holmes, I am here as a courtesy. You've done the Crown a service, even if you didn't intend to. What Balfour and Calder attempted to protect was not merely reputation. It was the concealment of what some still consider a necessary evil. The Empire's engines run on such things." "Slavery," Holmes said bluntly. Aldwych shifted slightly. "In all but name, yes. Though the men behind it are dying off or scattering, there are still those who would be implicated were this to emerge publicly. Members of Parliament, Admiralty retirees, even a few current Foreign Office envoys." "And your visit here," Holmes said, "is meant to secure my silence." "No," Aldwych replied quickly. "We're past that now. Too many hands have touched this, too many documents copied. What we want is your cooperation. There's to be an internal tribunal, not public, not for the courts, but there will be consequences, quiet ones." I glanced at Holmes, who said nothing. Aldwych continued. "We are asking you, Mr. Holmes, to step away. You've already brought the match to the powder. Let us manage the flame." Holmes rose slowly, crossing to the window. The morning light cut across his features, and I could see the flicker of disdain in his eyes. "I'm not a man easily bribed," he said. Aldwych stood as well. "This is not a bribe, Mr. Holmes. It is an appeal. You uncovered the truth. Let others now carry it forward." There was a pause. Then Holmes turned and gave the man a single, slow nod. "I will not interfere, but I will not forget." Aldwych accepted this with a dip of the head, gathered his gloves, and left with the quiet efficiency of a man who had closed many such conversations. After the door clicked shut, Holmes turned to me, hands clasped behind his back. "That," he said, "was the end of the formal road." "But not the end of the case," I replied. "No." He moved to the table and pulled a folded page from beneath a stack of reports. "There's still one name we've not accounted for, the fifth man in the photograph." I crossed the room. Holmes laid the picture flat and pointed to the shadowed figure at the far end, narrower than the others, slouched, his face turned slightly from the lens. The name beside him had never appeared in any manifest. "He was listed only as MD, Holmes said. "No other record, no rank, but he appears in the ship's log entries more than once, always near Trilling, always in connection to the stored crates." "Madani?" I guessed. "The surname from the manifest?" "Unlikely," Holmes said. "I now believe MD stands for Dr. Michael Dervan, a naval physician, struck from official records in 1871 following a charge of insubordination in Ceylon, quietly dismissed." "And now?" "Gone," Holmes said, "for decades, until yesterday when I received this." He passed me a telegram. It had been forwarded through the Lisbon consulate. "Man matching Dervan's description seen operating clinic in Tangier under alias. Claims former naval service. Known locally as Dr. M. Suspect ties to smuggling routes from Casablanca."
GRGR? I asked. Inspector Gregson, Holmes replied. On temporary assignment in Gibraltar, I sent him the photo a week ago on a whim. So he's alive? Holmes tapped the table. And he may be the last living link to the Red Flood, a man who was there, who never spoke, and who chose exile over exposure. I hesitated. You're thinking of going to Tangier? Holmes nodded. I must. There's more to Dervan's silence than fear. He vanished before Trilling attempted to speak out. I suspect he knew something the others feared would surface through him. You'll confront him? If he'll speak. If not, Holmes trailed off, then smiled faintly. There are other ways. There was something renewed in his bearing, an energy that had dulled in the days of waiting and watching. He was no longer a man bracing for institutional silence. He was back in motion. We departed the following evening aboard a steamer from Tilbury, carrying only essentials: the photograph, a copy of Trilling's journal, and a letter from Scotland Yard authorising discreet inquiry. Holmes, however, carried something else in his coat pocket, a folded note from Clara Bell, received just that morning. It read, "You said the truth had weight. I carry some too. Thank you for showing me it can be put down without shame." He read it once more as the ship passed into open sea, then tucked it away without a word. I watched him in the fading light, the wind pressing his coat to his frame, and I realized that though the puzzle of the rusted chain had begun in a quiet estate in Surrey, it was now crossing borders, languages, and oceans. We were not just following a criminal now, we were following a shadow cast over decades, a secret wound that had never fully healed. And though I could not yet see the final shape of it, I knew with certainty we were headed toward its heart. We arrived in Tangier under a sky heavy with dusk, the scent of sea salt and sun-baked stone clinging to the narrow streets like old memory. The city was a blur of domes and terraces, caught between the Atlantic and the Sahara, a place where exiles faded into the scenery and the past could be bartered like coin. Holmes, his gait purposeful as ever, led us from the port without hesitation. Word had arrived just that morning. Dr. M, as he was known here, operated a modest clinic in the old Casbah quarter, treating sailors and dock workers in exchange for whatever they could offer. No license, no official standing, but his reputation for discretion was legend. We found the clinic tucked beneath a crumbling archway, its door ajar, a brass lantern swaying gently above. Inside, the scent of camphor mingled with desert dust. A thin man with a greying beard looked up from his desk, his posture stiffened before Holmes even spoke. "Dr. Dervan?" Holmes said evenly. "Or should I say, the last ghost of the Red Flood?" The man stood slowly. He did not deny it. "You've come far," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I've followed the trail of a rusted chain," Holmes replied, "and the men bound by it. 4 names have now been accounted for. You are the 5th. Dervan's eyes closed for a moment. Then he motioned to 2 chairs near the wall. "You've read the records?" he asked as we sat. "All of them," Holmes said. "Trilling's logbook, Balfour's confession, even the letter you wrote but never sent." Dervan looked surprised. "The letter?" "The one Clara Bell found hidden behind a false panel in the boathouse. Trilling had kept it, perhaps as a reminder of your courage, or your cowardice. Dated 1871. You wrote of what was in the crates. You called it a moral sickness. You said you were leaving, that the rest could hang for all you cared." Dervan lowered his gaze. "I couldn't stay, not after what I saw. Trilling wanted to bring it into the light. I wanted to run." "And so you did," Holmes said quietly. But here's what I still don't understand. Why did Balfour fear you, years later, more than Trilling? Dervin was silent. Then he stood and walked to a locked drawer behind the desk. He returned with a leather-bound folio. Inside were pages, thick with ink, maps, manifests, names, initials, financial routes. The entire clandestine operation behind the Red Flood and her sister ships, written in a cipher, only Dervin and Trilling understood. "I kept a copy," he said. "Trilling thought I destroyed it. Balfour feared I hadn't." Holmes exhaled slowly. "This is the route, the archive, the web. This implicates not just officers, but financiers, ministers, dockmasters, and foreign liaisons. The entire apparatus. And now it's yours," Dervin said, pushing it across the table. Holmes made no move to touch it. "I have a question for you," he said instead. "Why now? Why give it up?" Dervin's face creased with something not quite regret, weariness perhaps, or release. "Because I'm tired," he said. "Because Trilling died trying to do the right thing and I ran. Because maybe, if someone like you finishes it, I won't have lived for nothing." Holmes nodded once. Then, after a long pause, he picked up the folio and stood. "There will be inquiries," he said. "You'll be called to testify, perhaps quietly, perhaps not at all, but your name will surface." Dervin only nodded. "Let it." That night we returned to our lodging in silence. Holmes said little on the voyage home, but I could see the change in him, not relief, not triumph, but a kind of deep, enduring gravity. He had begun this journey chasing the death of a single man. He had uncovered a ledger of sins long buried beneath the polished crust of the empire. 3 weeks later, in a sealed court under Admiralty jurisdiction, the tribunal convened. Names were read into record, files were accepted into evidence. A quiet purge began behind closed doors, retirements, revocations, exiles disguised as illness or travel. The public never knew. But change, however slow and small, had begun. Back at Baker Street, the folio lay sealed in a box beside Holmes's desk. Scotland Yard had taken copies. The original remained with Holmes. "Why not turn it over entirely?" I asked him one evening as the wind rattled the windows. Holmes looked at me. "Because there will be another inquiry, perhaps in 5 years, perhaps in 50, and when that time comes someone will need the truth, uncut. Bureaucracies forget, but documents remember. And you? I'll remember too, until the end." I stood then, pouring us both a measure of brandy. The fire glowed gently in the hearth. The city moved on outside our windows. "You know, Holmes," I said after a pause, "this wasn't our usual kind of case." "No, Watson," he said with the faintest smile. "This one mattered." We raised our glasses. To truth? To the dead who had waited to be heard, to the rusted chain that had finally broken, and to the man who, once again, had seen the world not just as it was, but as it ought to be.